preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
And I have the pleasure of being the Associate Executive Director for Programming here at the 92nd Street Y, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. As you may know, this evening is part of our multi-year look at our nation that we call Project America. Last year, during our We the People year, we looked at her people, and this year we are taking a multidisciplinary look at the values and beliefs that Americans hold dear. Certainly there is nothing that we value more than freedom. And the question for tonight is, what do we, and I guess what have we, meant by that term? I am pleased to introduce to you our first and main speaker for this evening, Dr. Eric Foner. Dr. Foner is DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University. He is the author of many books, including Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, The Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War, Tom Paine in Revolutionary America, and Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, which won the Bancroft Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. His most recent book, which he will be signing, which is available for sale, and also he will be signing after the program right outside, is called The Story of American Freedom, the subject that he and our other guests will be discussing tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Eric Foner.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the 92nd Street Y, where so many excellent events have taken place over the years of all kinds. Let me just say a word about our format for this evening. I will talk for about 20 minutes, I guess, about how I think about and have written about the history of the idea of freedom in this country. And then our two panelists, Randall Kennedy and Katha Pollitt, will speak more briefly, and then maybe we'll exchange a couple of ideas and then invite the audience to suggest their ideas about freedom, because of course in this country everybody has some notion of what freedom is. You don't have to have a PhD in quantum mechanics to have thoughts about freedom. And then, as Helene mentioned, and since we do live in a capitalist society, I would be happy to sign any books that anybody would like to purchase later on. But let me begin by mentioning an episode in the history of freedom in this country. Some of you may remember this. I write about it in my book. It took place a little over 50 years ago, beginning in 1947, and this is the story of the Freedom Train. This was a traveling exhibition of 133 cherished historical documents of American history, which toured the United States to over 300 cities in a 16-month period. It included the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address and many other important pieces of Americana. The idea for the Freedom Train, which was perhaps the most elaborate patriotic ritual in American history, at least in peacetime, originated right after World War II with the Department of Justice in order to contrast American ideas of freedom with Nazi tyranny in the aftermath of the war. But since direct government funding smacked of propaganda, the direction of the Freedom Train was turned over to a nonprofit institution called the American Heritage Foundation, headed by Winthrop W. Aldrich, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. Now, the Freedom Train was a tremendous success. It attracted over 3.5 million visitors, and many more took part in parades and forums and other events that accompanied its journey. It achieved a great grassroots response, which, according to the New Republic at that time, revealed a deep popular hunger for tangible evidence of American freedom. But behind the scenes, the Freedom Train demonstrated that the actual meaning of freedom was not uncontroversial. The initial list of documents had been drawn up by liberal or New Deal staff members at the National Archives. They had included the Wagner Act, of the 1930s, which had given labor the legal right to collective bargaining. They had included President Roosevelt's For Freedom speech of 1941, which had outlined Allied war aims, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and the vaguely socialistic freedom from want. But these were eliminated. The Wagner Act and the For Freedom speech were eliminated from the Freedom Train by the American Heritage Foundation. Also evicted from the Freedom Train were the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, which had, right after the Civil War, had granted African Americans equality before the law and the right to vote. Also, President Roosevelt's executive order of 1941 establishing the Fair Employment Practices Commission was taken off the Freedom Train. In fact, in the end, of the 133 documents, none referred to organized labor or 20th century social legislation, and only 3, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and one other document, referred at all to Black Americans. In fact, African Americans were quite skeptical initially about the Freedom Train. The poet Langston Hughes wrote a publicized poem at that time, wondering, would there be Jim Crow on the Freedom Train? He wrote, "When it stops in Mississippi, will it be made plain everybody's got a right to board the Freedom Train?" Now, in fact, with the Truman administration about to make civil rights a major priority, the train's organizers announced that they would not permit segregated viewing. In an unprecedented move, the American Heritage Foundation canceled visits to Birmingham and Memphis when local authorities insisted on segregating visitors to the Freedom Train by race. The Freedom Train did visit 47 other southern cities without incident, and in the end it was hailed in the black press for breaching, at least temporarily, the walls of segregation. So the Freedom Train reflected a growing sense of national unease in the aftermath of World War II over overt expressions of racial discrimination. But as it went along, it also revealed the growing impact of the Cold War on definitions of freedom. It quickly became caught up in the emerging ideological struggle with communism, even though its closest precedent was the Lenin Train of 1918, which had brought Bolshevik books, newspapers, films, and posters into the Russian countryside. Soon before, or just before the Freedom Train was launched, President Truman had announced the Truman Doctrine, committing the United States to the worldwide containment of Soviet power. Soon, Attorney General Tom Clark was praising the Freedom Train for keeping, quote, foreign ideologies out of the United States, and, quote, aiding the country in its war against subversive elements. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover began compiling dossiers on people who criticized the Freedom Train or seemed unenthusiastic about it. The Freedom Train inaugurated a period when the language of freedom suffused American politics and culture, but it also revealed how the Cold War was reshaping freedom's meaning, identifying it with anti-communism, free enterprise, and the defense of the social and economic status quo. Now, this story of the Freedom Train is one episode in my book, The Story of American Freedom, which traces the idea of freedom from the United States, in the United States, from the Revolution down to the present. I have begun with it because this story reveals in microcosm the basic theme of my book, which is that rather than being fixed or permanent, the definition of freedom is the subject of persistent conflict and debate in American history. The Freedom Train also points to the 3 major themes that I use to organize this history of freedom in America. The first is the meaning of freedom, or the definition. What have different people thought freedom means at different points in our history? The second is what I call the social conditions of freedom. What conditions of life are necessary to enable people to enjoy freedom, no matter how they define it? And the third is what I call the boundaries of freedom. That is, who is entitled to enjoy freedom and who is excluded from it. Now, I'm sure you'd agree that no idea is more fundamental to Americans' sense of themselves as individuals or as a nation than freedom. This is the central word in our political vocabulary. Freedom or liberty, with which it is used pretty much interchangeably. The Declaration of Independence lists liberty among mankind's inalienable rights. The Constitution announces its purpose is to secure the blessings of liberty. The United States fought the Civil War to bring about a new birth of freedom. It fought World War II for the four freedoms. It fought the Cold War to defend what was called the free world. Our love of freedom has been represented by liberty poles, liberty caps, statues of liberty. It's been acted out by burning stamps and burning draft cards, by running away from slavery, and by demonstrating for the right to vote. Every man in the street, white, black, red, or yellow, wrote Ralph Bunche in 1940, knows that this is the land of the free and the cradle of liberty. Now, as I say, despite our agreement on the importance of liberty in our culture, Americans have never fully agreed on what freedom really is. Rather than seeing freedom as a fixed concept, I see it as what philosophers call an essentially contested idea, one that by its very nature is the subject of disagreement. Freedom has been seen as a set of individual rights and a form of national empowerment. It's been applied to individuals, to communities, to families, to persons within the family, and to the nation itself. But my main point is that this very debate has taken place throughout our society. The cast of characters of the story of American freedom is a rich and varied one. The meaning of freedom has been constructed not only in congressional debates and political treatises, but on plantations and picket lines, in parlors, and even in bedrooms. The cast of characters, as I say, includes Thomas Jefferson and Victoria Woodhull, Abraham Lincoln and Margaret Sanger, Franklin D. Roosevelt and former slaves seeking to breathe substantive meaning into emancipation during the Civil War. Now, if freedom has been a battleground or source of debate throughout our history, so too has been what I call the boundary, the definition of those entitled to enjoy it. It's hardly original to point out that the United States, founded on the premise that liberty is an entitlement of all mankind, blatantly deprived many of its own people of freedom. At the time of the Revolution, there were 750 or more thousand slaves in the United States, denied the blessings of liberty. More to the point, rather than just showing the contradiction, the very struggle of groups who have considered themselves deprived of freedom has expanded the definition of freedom for all Americans. It's through these battles at the boundaries, the efforts of racial minorities, of women, of workers, of other groups to secure freedom as they understood it, that the meaning of freedom has been transformed and the concept extended into realms for which it was not originally intended. In other words, the story of American freedom is not just a saga of a fixed set of rights to which one group after another plugs in or gains access. Time and again, the definition of those rights has been transformed by the demands of excluded groups for inclusion. Now, in the remaining few minutes that I have, I am not going to try to summarize 200 years or more of the history of freedom. That is really the subject of my book. But let me just touch on a couple of high points, or low points perhaps, as well, in this history. One is the American Revolution, which gave birth to a distinctive American understanding of freedom. In the colonial period, and even in the run-up to the Revolution, the American patriots had defended their resistance to British laws as part of the rights of Englishmen. They had defined themselves as defending their rights under the British Constitution. The rights of the enjoyment of English freedom was a parochial idea. It was a set of entitlements born out of the constitutional struggles of England, the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, etc., etc. It applied only to Englishmen. The British and American white colonists did not consider it a contradiction to talk about England as the freest nation on earth and the rights of Englishmen while transporting millions of Africans into slavery in the New World. Because by definition, the freedom of Englishmen did not apply to Africans. But the American Revolution created a nation in which freedom was a universal entitlement, second only to life itself in the Declaration of Independence. The freedom was transformed from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of man, and a nation was created which saw itself as the embodiment of liberty for all mankind and an asylum for freedom for those oppressed in the old world. This is what Tom Paine said in Common Sense, the clarion call for American independence. But as I said, the revolution also revealed the inner contradiction of freedom by giving birth to a republic rhetorically founded on liberty, but also resting economically in large measure on slavery. The way slavery shaped our definition of our sense of ourselves as Americans was clearly shown in the very first naturalization law of 1790, one of the first laws passed by Congress under the Constitution. This limited the process of becoming a citizen by immigration from abroad to white persons. In other words, a nation which declared itself the asylum for freedom omitted or excluded the vast majority of the world's population from actually coming here and partaking of the blessings of liberty. It was only the abolitionist movement later on which resurrected this notion of freedom as a universal birthright and actually gave birth to the idea of citizenship as an entitlement of all persons born in the United States. Before the Civil War, freedom was defined racially. The Dred Scott decision declared very clearly that no black person could be a citizen of the United States. It was the struggle against slavery which gave rise to the notion of birthright citizenship, of a notion of Americanness as equal rights before the law for all, regardless of race. This was written into our Constitution after the Civil War as a result of the struggle against slavery. Now, jumping into the 20th century, another key moment in the redefinition of freedom came in the progressive era, early in the 20th century, when the question of what was called economic or industrial freedom came to the fore of political debate. Freedom, the progressive reformers, the labor movement, and others insisted, had a substantive economic content. It was not so much laissez-faire, letting everybody do whatever they want in a free market, but creating economic security, or in the phrase of the time, a living wage, or the American standard of living. This is the origin of what President Roosevelt would later call freedom from want as an essential element of freedom, or what I called a social condition of freedom. And this notion of freedom sank very deep roots in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, among ordinary workers, among middle-class people. It was highlighted by President Roosevelt during the New Deal, who captured, you might say, the word freedom and made it a rallying cry of the New Deal. As early as 1934, in his second fireside chat, Roosevelt juxtaposed his own definition of liberty as economic security for the average man to the older notion of freedom of contract, that is, the free market as the arbiter of freedom, and consistently linked freedom with economic security and economic equality. The liberty of a democracy, he declared, is not safe if citizens are unable to sustain an acceptable standard of living. Now, one could trace this out after the Cold War, after the World War II, how a somewhat different vision of economic freedom came to the fore, based much more on access to the consumer marketplace. Again, high or low points. One of these was the famous kitchen debate, which you may remember, which Vice President Nixon took part in with Soviet Premier Khrushchev in 1959 at the American Industrial Exposition in Moscow, which was a a showcase of American consumer products, automobiles, and hi-fi sets, and the centerpiece was a mechanized kitchen of a suburban home, complete with a robot that swept the floors. Vice President Nixon's speech opening the exposition was called "What Freedom Means to Us." Instead of talking about civil liberties or democracy or different systems of government, what the vice president talked about as what freedom means to us was there were 56 million cars in the United States, 52 million television sets. Freedom meant the ability to consume in the cornucopia of goods produced by modern capitalism. As to the kitchen, he pointed to the automatic floor sweeper and said, "You don't even need a wife in the United States." In fact, it was left to Soviet Premier Khrushchev to argue that freedom must have some higher meaning than simply a bunch of consumer products. It was in the 1960s that the Civil Rights Revolution, the freedom movement as it called itself, with its freedom rides and freedom songs and insistent cry, "Freedom Now," resurrected the idea of freedom as the rallying cry of the dispossessed. And of course, the notion of freedom, of liberation as the civil rights movement used it, was then taken up by its successor movements, such as the second wave of feminism or other movements that have continued down to the present day, gay liberation, and many others, all using freedom to claim their own place of equality in modern life. The women's movement, I should say, plays a very important role in my book because in its various incarnations, I argue, throughout the 19th and 20th century, the women's movement has extended the idea of freedom into the most intimate areas of life, into the family itself, breaching the barrier between the public and private realms of existence, claiming freedom in personal life, in sexual life, in control over one's own body as an essential element of freedom. This was not what the Founding Fathers had in mind, but it's a good example of how the notion of freedom has been expanded over time by the claims of various groups of Americans. Now, just to finish, today, if you look around for uses of freedom, you will find that the term has been pretty much appropriated by conservatives of one kind or another. If you search the internet for freedom, you will come up with militia groups holding up in Montana. You will come up with anti-tax and anti-government fanatics, private property advocates. Some of these older ideas like freedom from want or freedom as justice for dispossessed groups no longer seem to be part of our political vocabulary. One of the things that I kind of spent a lot of time on in this book was gathering illustrations about freedom, and at the very end there are a couple of pictures from the internet of websites of some of these right-wing militia groups claiming the mantle of freedom. Now, my intrepid publisher insisted I had to get their permission to reproduce their imagery. These groups do not believe in the government, but they do believe in the copyright laws. And I had some very interesting correspondence with the militia of Montana before they allowed me to use their image. They did volunteer to come and address my classes at Columbia free of charge anytime I wanted. I'm still considering that. But anyway, let me just conclude my little presentation here by saying that the one thing that I think we can conclude, that we can gather from this very brief history of freedom is that it is an open-ended history. It has not concluded yet. It's unfinished. And the one thing that makes me very optimistic looking to the future and the next century is that we can decide to make freedom whatever we think it ought to be. Now, I will stop there, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the next commentator here, Randall Kennedy, who is a professor at the Harvard Law School, the author of many books, including one on race and the law, and a very distinguished lawyer, and like all of us, connected in some way with the magazine The Nation. He and I are on the editorial board of The Nation. Katha Pollitt is a columnist for The Nation. Let me introduce Randall Kennedy to talk for a few minutes.
Thank you very much. The social conditions of freedom is a central theme in Eric Foner's The Story of American Freedom. At one time or another, he writes, Americans have identified as obstacles to the enjoyment of individual freedom governmental authority, social pressures of conformity, bureaucratic institutions, private arrangements like the traditional family, and concentrated economic power. Another major obstacle to the enjoyment of freedom is ignorance. That is why education should figure into any comprehensive history of struggles for freedom, and in fact does so in Foner's account. Hence, he properly notes the sobering significance of slaveholders denying the rudiments of literacy to their human property, the ongoing relevance of Supreme Court decisions invalidating efforts by states to outlaw the teaching of foreign languages in public schools, and the inspiring example of the freedom schools in Mississippi, which bravely challenged the ideology of white supremacy in the leading nation of the so-called free world. During my few minutes with you this evening, I want to focus on an important element in the infrastructure of freedom, a type of person that is essential to nourishing the social conditions of freedom. I want to focus on the teacher. The teacher is the one who frees us of our ignorance, the one who warns us away from unforeseen traps, the one who sees within us capabilities that we ourselves overlook, the one who awakens and guides and nourishes our ambitions, the one whose high expectations raises our sights, the one who provides the encouragement needed to overcome the confines of timidity, sometimes a timidity that has been reinforced by the ancient enemies of talent, bigotry. When I think of the good teacher, I think of our principal speaker, Eric Foner. He is a person who has helped to emancipate the minds of thousands of people over the course of his still young career. That he should have chosen a life of teaching is not altogether surprising. After all, his mother, Lisa Foner, his father, Jack D. Foner, and his uncle, Philip S. Foner, were all distinguished teachers who clearly inculcated within Eric a love for their calling. Professor Foner has pursued his calling in a variety of ways, three of which include his written scholarship, his activism as a citizen, and his personal mentorship of students. First, a few comments about the written scholarship. That, of course, is the aspect of his career that we primarily focus upon and celebrate this evening. There are 3 points about his scholarship that it seems to me worth noting. One, given that we're here talking about his latest book, The Story of American Freedom, one aspect about his career has to do with his long-standing interest in freedom. If one turns to the quite ample scholarly record of Eric Foner, one sees that this latest book, The Story of American Freedom, is not the first book that has included the title freedom in it. So, his first major book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. Then we have another book, Nothing But Freedom, Emancipation and Its Legacy. And then yet a third book, Freedom's Lawmakers, a directory of Black Reconstruction office holders. And then this book, which is in a sense the summation of a long-standing interest in freedom in American life. A second thing about Eric Foner's books, they've been quite successful. He's won a good number of prizes, Bancroft Prize, Parkman Prize, Owsley Prize. They've also been praised by a wide array of people, which is worth noting because, after all, academia is, including the historical section of academia, is rent by all sorts of divisions, methodological divisions, ideological divisions. Yet somehow Eric Foner's books have been able to attract applause really quite universally. So we have David Donald applauding Eric Foner's work, and we have Herbert Aptheker applauding Eric Foner's work. That's quite an ideological spectrum there. And I think it's worthwhile maybe noting, why is this so? And just quickly, one has to do with the fact that his books, though clearly, they've clearly been respected by his professional colleagues, they're also accessible to the general reader. And this last book, The Story of American Freedom, is no different. It's a book that a trained historian, will learn a lot from. It's also a book that any person will read and gain much instruction from. Second, the books tend to have a considerable amount of narrative, but they're also thematic. They're all books with a point. He's driving a position in all of them, but even though he's driving a position, they also have a nice narrative texture to them, which again makes them accessible. Finally, thirdly, they're present-minded. They're books that are firmly rooted in present-day concerns, though they're also always respectful of the present. The present-mindedness does not master the past. The past is always respected, though Eric Foner's books try to make the past relevant to us by showing how the past is connected to our present anxieties, our present concerns. Third, Eric Foner's books are political. He is a progressive, an unapologetic progressive. He's a person of the left, keenly attuned to social injustice. And this keen attentiveness to social injustice shows itself in a variety of ways in his books. The thing that captures my imagination the most, though, and that I'm most impressed with, is the extent to which he has always been attentive in all of his books to the wide range of people who make our history. He's attentive, of course, to the people in the highly placed people, the man in the White House, but he's also attentive to the lowly and the way in which the lowly make history too. If I could point to one particular anecdote that Professor Foner has used, it has to do with one of the central documents in the history of American freedom, the Emancipation Proclamation. When the Emancipation Proclamation was finally signed, promulgated by Abraham Lincoln, there were some who suggested that it was all too little. And there have been a number of historians who have suggested that the Emancipation Proclamation was really a quite barren document. One of the historians who took this position was a teacher of Eric Foner's, a wonderful historian by the name of Richard Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter once said of the Emancipation Proclamation that it had all of the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. And that's because the Emancipation Proclamation left enslaved some 800,000 slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed those slaves that were still in the hands of the Confederates. So slaves that were in the hands of people fighting on behalf of the Union remained slaves. Eric Foner, in his work, recognizes the limits of the Emancipation Proclamation, but he's very careful to talk about the way in which the slaves breathed life into the Emancipation Proclamation. And he tells us about what some slaves on the coast of South Carolina did when they heard about the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. They had waited up to hear whether Lincoln had signed it, and when they heard Lincoln had signed it, what did they do? They sang, "My country, 'tis of thee." And it was the slaves in that instance and after that that gave real life and meaning and pushed the meaning of American freedom. And that is an aspect of the history of American freedom that Eric Foner has presented in this volume, and that has been an aspect of his writing in previous volumes. Now, there's a second way in which I think Professor Foner has been a very useful and instructive teacher, and that has to do with his activities as a mere citizen, is obviously a very accomplished person, but one of the things that I think is very useful to see, one of the things that's very useful to see in his career is that one could be a very accomplished person at the height of his profession, the apex of his profession, and still be an active citizen. And that's been the case for a long time. Eric Foner, when he was a student at Columbia College, was active in a group called Action. As a student, as the student president of Action, he got the registry of off-campus housing at Columbia University to promise that they would no longer list landlords who were unwilling to sign an anti-discrimination pledge. Subsequently, again as a student, Eric Foner participated in this city in the picketing of various places, various firms which practiced segregation in the South, and so he, along with others in the 1960s, picketed to show solidarity with students in the South who were writing a grand chapter in the history of American freedom. And that activism has continued. Sometimes we see it in articles that he writes for publications like The Nation. Sometimes you see it in the opinion editorial columns that he writes in places like the New York Times. Actually, the place that I most enjoy seeing it is in Eric Foner's letters to the editor. And for people who read the Times, you must know that at least once, I'd say every 2 months, when there's a slip up, you'll see a letter from the editor, Eric Foner. Let me just mention one that caught my eye. Person wrote an article about Stuyvesant Town. Very nostalgic article about Stuyvesant Town. You know, the sort of article that was supposed to make you sort of have a feel-good, warm, fuzzy feeling. Prompted Eric Foner to write a letter, very short letter, just two paragraphs, pointing out that when Stuyvesant Town was established, it was racially discriminatory, did not allow black people to participate in the housing that had been made available. 2 paragraphs. It was an act of public education. And it seems to me it's an important thing, and it's an act of public education that warrants notice. Finally, I'd like to mention Eric Foner's work as a teacher in his in the form of his mentorship, of many students over the years. And I feel this very intensely because I'm one of those students. I met Eric Foner I forget how many years ago. It was a good many years ago now. He was a visitor at my undergraduate institution, Princeton. And I remember meeting him and talking with him. My senior thesis was on Richard Hofstadter, who was Eric Foner's mentor. And that's been a very important, his interactions with me. And I have many colleagues, there were other students at Princeton that year that he visited. And as we talk about our times in college, the name of Eric Foner comes up over and over again. And it has made a difference. And it's a difference that warrants a notice. It warrants applause. It warrants praise. It warrants praise in part, I know this because I know it in part because of the way in which Eric Foner has talked about his mentors. The way in which over the years Eric Foner has talked about James Shenton and Herbert Gutman and Richard Hofstadter, thereby paying homage to the teacher. And so, and here I'm going to subside, I think that Eric Foner is deserving of the attention he's gotten. He's deserving of our applause because he hasn't simply been a chronicler of American freedom, but through his work in various ways, his intellectual labors in various ways, he's also contributed to American freedom and helped to advance it. And for that, I am very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Well, that's very, very kind, I must say. Thank you very much, Randy Kennedy. Katha Pollitt is a very well-known writer on public issues, a columnist for The Nation. You see her also in The New Yorker and many other magazines. And if ever a slip-up in the world of freedom takes place, we normally can expect Katha to be there sounding the alarm and setting the perpetrators straight. So Katha Pollitt is the last speaker.
Thank you. It's such a wonderful book. So before I give you my own thoughts about freedom, the word, the thing, I want to add my praise to Randall Kennedy's. It's a great book. You should all buy it. I learned something on every page, and unless you know as much as Eric, you will too. And one of the things I learned, this is so awful, is the founder of The Nation, E.L. Godkin, who is currently decorating our pages as the in the form of the E.L. Godkin Brigade, in which subscribers are urged to recruit another person to take out a subscription. Well, it turns out E.L. Godkin, who is a character in Eric's book, was horrible. E.L. Godkin wanted to take the franchise away from people who had it and reinstitute property qualifications because he thought, oh, too many stupid, ignorant people are voting. It would be better if it was just left to experts, which is a major theme of the 20th century part of Eric's book, the temptation for intellectuals of thinking they ought to run the world. And of course, every time they do get to run the world, it's a big disaster. So I learned about E.L. Godkin, and then of course I had to email Victor right away and say, got to think about this. And I also learned about Proposition 14 in California. One of the themes of Eric's book, at least for me, is how we live in the present and we think all the bad things are in the past. But it's interesting how close to the present those bad things come. For example, Proposition 14 in California was passed in 1964 by a 3/4 vote, and it said, there should be no fair housing laws. You don't want to sell your home to a black person, you don't have to. And guess who thought that was really great? Ronald Reagan. Well, he became president and talked about ethnic purity. Remember that? The ethnic purity of neighborhoods. So we're coming uncomfortably close to our own day, and it becomes less and less surprising when we find, as the New York Times reports pretty much every year, some fair housing organization sends out the testers, the nice middle-class white couple, the nice middle-class black couple, and the white couple gets all these wonderful apartments, and the black people are told, oh, you should have been here 15 minutes ago. We just rented that. And so a really interesting thing for me about Eric's book is it's true that the meaning of freedom and liberty are always changing, and that's so fascinating. He quotes Abraham Lincoln, I think it is, at one point, saying, we use these words, but we don't mean the same thing when we use them. And I felt reading Eric's book for the first time, I understood that when an 18th century gentleman talked about his freedom and liberty, he wasn't talking about what I'm talking about. And that's how it was that Southerners could think that they were defending freedom, because what they meant was the freedom to deprive other people of their freedom. It has all these constantly changing meanings, and yet what I found was that there are themes in American history, that these meanings never really go away. They're always lurking around, they're always available, they're always in the big pool of meaning, like the sea of stories, the sea of meanings of these key words of our history. And so I find that when I spend time on these horrible right-wing websites, I'm a constant visitor to the militia of Montana. They talk about these documents in American history that, Eric, you know what they are, the Virginia Compact, the Charlotte document, that things that are, just totally forgotten for them, and they are trying to resuscitate the meaning of freedom and liberty is nobody gets to tell you, the government doesn't get to tell you what to do. You get to do whatever you want with your property and your wife and your gun. And they're pretending that they live in the 18th century, only with automatic weapons. And I have to say, parenthetically, something that's very interesting about these websites, which is not so characteristic of the 18th century, of their equivalent in the 18th century, is you can go to any of these right-wing websites, and in 2 minutes, you are in intense anti-Semitism land. They all have links to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They all have links to just the most horrible, weird documents and strange anti-Semitic rantings and ravings. I mean, it's the Jew-United States for them. And so that's a sort of weird little feature of them that I think should not be forgotten when we shouldn't let them just have their language of freedom and liberty and all the rest of it, because that's not really what they're about. But anyway, Eric invited me not to talk about women and feminism. He says, I don't want to put you in a box. You don't have to talk about that if you don't want to. But of course, I do. So I will. One of the great things about Eric's book is, and it's unusual, I have to say, for a male historian, at least in my experience, is how fully integrated he has made the experience of women and their relationship to freedom and liberty, and our movement for equality, how he has integrated that into the story. It's not like in our children's history books now, there's a little box, famous women. It's part of the story, and the way that, as Randall said, the way that women have, the women's movement has changed in very fundamental ways, our sense of what privacy means, what the relationship between the public and the private is, who counts as a person, all that sort of thing is extremely subtly handled and very interesting. And it's one of the few times where I really felt that I was reading a book in which the story of my rights was part of the real story of America. So that was all great. Thinking about these words, freedom and liberty, got me thinking about a word we don't hear very often, which is in the same language, family, and that's the word liberation. You remember that in the 60s, of course I was too young for that, but I heard about it later. You remember it wasn't women's rights, and it wasn't women's choices. It was women's liberation. And it was black liberation. It was, our government was engaged in fighting a war, you'll remember, with a national liberation movement in Vietnam. And that was the big word. Well, where's that word now? It's nowhere. And I think that's so fascinating. We used to have women's liberation, sexual freedom. We even had free love, although that had a kind of dated ring because of love, But now it's women's rights and choice. And you can see this so clearly in the flashpoint. Sort of curiously, and only in America, the flashpoint for all the turmoil surrounding changing gender roles and the increased autonomy and personhood of women is abortion. And this is, major big issue, even though, of course, the pollsters always tell you that nobody cares. They do. And abortion came into politics, into public politics, as part of women's liberation. It was about being a whole person, making the life you wanted, having children when and where you wanted, with the person you wanted, not being forced into marriages, all the rest of it. Your health being the real important thing here. And there has been such a retreat, along with the sort of general conservative tide, there has been a tremendous retreat from this language, which I find so interesting. And now it's, well, you have a choice. Well, that's a good word. That's a good American word. Consumer choice, right? One of the interesting themes in Eric's book is the way that consumerism becomes a kind of an arena in which these words, liberty and freedom and their family, that whole family of words become, they move into that as meaning drains out of politics, it moves into to consumerism. And the other, and women's rights. Well, it's what you have from the government. Rights is, at least in our diction, it's the government is not supposed to tell you what to do in these areas, right? And you were a free person making your choices. But liberation is a different thing, because liberation isn't just about what the government can and can't tell you to do. It's about social change. And as we all know, and I think about this every day, as we all know, it's very rare that you really come up against a law, right? My father, who is a lawyer, said something so wonderful once. I've always remembered it. We were discussing some Supreme Court case, and I said, gee, who is this strange person bringing this case? And he said, well, ordinary people don't find themselves making constitutional precedent. And if you look at these Supreme Court cases, the person who really is going to go to the mat for their right to have child pornography or whatever, they're a little strange. But most people, it doesn't come up, because most people are controlled at a different level. They're controlled at the outset, around the edges, by the knowledge of what the law is and what will happen if they get arrested. But if you think of the way we live, why do we talk the way we do? Why do we dress the way we do? Why do we work at the jobs we have and treat our bosses the way we do? Why do married women change their names? They don't have to do that. There's no law that says you have to change your name, but most women do, even today. It's custom. It's because people are enmeshed in a web of human relationships that are not egalitarian. And a great deal of energy is expended to make people forget this and to make people think that they're making a free choice when they're not. And so you have people saying, well, now that we're free, we can wear stiletto heels again, you know. I'm expressing my freedom by having breast enhancement. You know, and what gets written is when you really had a choice, you didn't choose that, you know. Before your boss told you, you have to dress like a business person, you didn't dress like a business person. But how quickly one forgets that and shapes yourself to social expectations. And so liberation is a word that allows you to talk about all that in a way that rights doesn't. You've already got all your rights. You just don't have your liberation. And I think that distinction is one that failure to understand that has made people feel is one of the reasons why people feel all these liberation movements and these rights movements haven't gotten them very far, because it really only has gotten to the most sort of gross usages. Even though we might believe the personal is political, there's no wall between the public and the private is still pretty private, and the public is still pretty public. And in between those two worlds, people can get extremely confused. And the last thing I want to say is a curious thing I've noticed, which is there's the family of words having to do with freedom, liberty, liberation, all that. And then there's the other family of words, and that is the family of work, family, country, and religion. Now, it's a fascinating thing that, as Eric discusses very shrewdly in his book, the right has taken over freedom and liberty. It's just like they got the Heritage Foundation to buy those words from Vanna White, you know, and we don't get to use them anymore. And so instead of saying, wait, those are our words, we want those words back, I feel that, you know, on the left, among progressives, instead they're saying, hey, what about work, family, country, and religion? What about those words? Those are good words. Those are the words the working class really cares about, which I think is not true at all. But and so then we have endless organizations called Working Families, this or that. We have endless pieces in The Nation about how we have to become, ally ourselves with religion. Richard Rorty writes a book, Achieving Our Country, and it's all about the flag and all this kind of thing. And I think this is so fascinating that there has been, because those words, work, family, country, and religion, have always been the conservative words. You remember in the 30s, the French fascists, it was travail, patrie, famille, big Catholic fascist organizations with those banners marching down the streets of Paris. Maybe they still have them. Those words have always been connected with the right wing. And now, these are the words that the left wants. No, these are the wrong words. So anyway, that's all we need, right? To really collapse the wall of separation between church and state. This will really do our cause a lot of good. And respect for authority, that's the other one. This is cropping up too now, especially among the communitarians who present themselves as between left and right, is all over their literatures. People don't have enough respect for authority. I mean, really, what authority? What are they talking about? The authority that brought us the war in Vietnam, et cetera? That, the authority of the police in New York City, who every year the city has to pay millions and millions of dollars because of their police brutality, Talk about our tax dollars. Nobody talks about that use of our tax dollars. So anyway, all I want to say is it's extremely interesting to watch these words and concepts dance about. But Eric said at the end, he said that he thought the meaning of his book was that we can take these words and we can make of them what we want. And I must say, from your book, Eric, maybe we can talk about that. I got a little bit the other feeling, which is, as Marx said, we make our history, yes, but we don't make it just as we please. That I found myself thinking, you read this book and you think, there is no way the people in this book would go for socialism. They just wouldn't. They don't want to pay for it. They don't want to have that much to do with their neighbors. They don't want to give up the chance to become rich. They don't want to live with black people, et cetera, et cetera. And I just thought, it's amazing that the left got as far as it did in this country. So time will tell whether it will get further. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Katha Pollitt. I think since we have talked for a good while here, I think we will allow those in the audience who would like to raise a point or make a comment about freedom or anything that was said tonight to express their point of view. So the lighting, it makes it a little difficult. Now they're raising lights, okay, to see people, but so if I miss you, it's not it's inadvertent, but yes.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of points.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to take issue with Pollitt with a couple of points. First, it seems to me absurd for you to mention even passing that with an NLF and North Vietnam National Liberation Front. I know you tried those bad points, but it seems to me no clear illustration of a ridiculous thing. There's no liberty or freedom in Vietnam. It seems to me to be a farce that these people who demand liberty and freedom, perhaps just do not give it to people they disagree with, perhaps not even give it to themselves very much. Secondly, I disagree that there's, I agree with you that there's, outside of pregnancy, there's no reason anymore to compel marriage, no shotgun marriage anymore. I think that's good, but I think that when you said, though, that women do not get married if they're pregnant, or men do not marry if they're pregnant, well, I think that goes against the whole fabric of society. I think that illegitimacy is a sickness, a pathology in our country, and I think we're not France or Sweden or Italy, and I think there is a difference, and I think that something must be done about it, and I think I won't compel you to do anything that I disagree with those points.
Okay, let us, Katha, you can defend illegitimacy and the National Liberation Front if you wish.
Well, I don't defend the National Liberation Front. That was a linguistic point. I think I would probably agree with you that Vietnam under communism was not a place devoted to what anyone in this room would call real liberation, and we could debate all day why that was, and but we're not going to. But I'll just leave that there. About illegitimacy, well, you're entitled to your feelings, but you mentioned how we're not France, Sweden, or Italy. The fact is the rate of out-of-wedlock childbearing in this country is much higher than in those countries. That is the norm. You have an idea in your head of how people live, but the way people really live is quite different than that. And I think that people are kind of voting with their own lives onto where marriage is going to fit into the scheme of things. And again, we could debate all day why that's happening. But it is happening, and it's not going to go back, and so we just have to march on.
Okay. Yes, in the front here.
Yes. Does the U.S. capitalist, excuse me, I had to write this down.
That's all right.
Does the U.S. capitalist economic system in its current form allow for the flourishing of freedom for the majority of Americans? I particularly like Foner.
That's a good question. I think if I can slightly turn the question around, I think one of the key questions for freedom, or what I have called the social conditions of freedom as we enter, it's cliche-ridden to say this, but we are entering a new century, is the way, it's not the U.S. capitalist system per se, but how it is evolving and changing in this internationalizing direction very rapidly at the moment. Whether that allows for freedom in any meaningful sense, as we have historically understood it, is a serious problem that we're going to have to confront. I don't think this should be left to the Pat Buchanans of the world, who are the only people in the political spectrum who seem to be willing to raise it right now. Historically, economic freedom, which has meant many different things to different people in our history, has often been linked to some notion of democratic input to economic decision making, whether through governmental regulation or collective bargaining or other ways in which people can affect the economic decisions that shape their lives. Today, the basic economic decisions, people know this, you just pick up the New York Times and you'll see it every day, the basic economic decisions that affect our lives are being made by institutions which are international, multinational corporations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc., over which there is no semblance of any democratic control or input whatsoever. What freedom means in that kind of situation is, I think, a very open question, and I don't know the answer to it, but I think that is a serious problem that is going to have to be confronted in the next century as the kind of site of economic power sort of escapes into this world of the international, and it seems impossible at the moment for anybody to affect it at all. So I don't have an answer to that, but at least if that question can be put on the agenda of national discussion in a way it really isn't today, we can maybe begin to decide what we think freedom may be in that kind of social situation. Yes, in the back, go ahead.
According to your own definitions of freedom, what freedoms do you think Americans are deprived of today, either by the government or society?
Would anyone like to tackle that question? What freedoms are we deprived of today?
Well, certainly gay people are deprived of some freedoms quite openly. I mean, freedom to marry comes to mind. Gay people are still oppressed in a quite strong way. That's one. I'll leave it to others. That's the one that immediately comes to my mind.
Well, there are many, as I said, many definitions of what freedom is. There have been in the past. I think we enjoy many more freedoms today than at many other points in American history. I am not a total pessimist on the grounds that nothing has ever changed and things are getting worse and worse. Quite untrue. On the other hand, I don't think we're just on a straight line upward forever in which everything just gets better and better also. I think this realm of there are many threats to various kinds of freedom that we hold dear, the economic ones we just mentioned. Another one that I think is a problem, I don't know what the answer is the, what does freedom of speech mean in a world in which access to the modes of communication are increasingly monopolized by a few, conglomerates of entertainment and communication corporations. The Nation, one of the better things it has done is these issues showing the interlocking controls over newspapers, television stations, various modes of communication. When power in the market, in the economic place, in the economic marketplace coincides with power in the marketplace of ideas, you do have problems for freedom of speech. The problem is that our traditional concept of civil liberties sees the threat to freedom of expression as largely emanating from the government. The First Amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall pass no law limiting the freedom of speech, etc. That suggests that the great danger to freedom of speech is the federal government. Today, the federal government, with some exceptions, is not trying to suppress people's freedom of speech, but there are great concentrations of non-governmental power which are increasingly controlling the way expression is disseminated in the society, and that's sets up another set of issues about the future of freedom of expression, so dear to us, which I think, we're going to have to at least put on our political agenda. Yes, in the very back there.
Recently, our government has increased various economic sanctions around the world against third world countries. In your view, how dangerous this policy is?
I'm sorry, what was the question? It is increasingly doing what to third world countries?
Sanctions.
Oh, sanctions, economic sanctions.
Sanctions against third world countries around the world, and how dangerous this policy is to freedom of that we enjoy in this country. Is it going to threat?
Well, yeah, I'm not an expert enough, and I'm not sure that either of the panelists is, although I would be pleasantly surprised to learn that they are experts on the specific questions of economic sanctions. I think you raise a question which is important in the history of freedom, which is that identifying your country with the universal ideal of freedom and the worldwide embodiment of freedom does have certain unfortunate consequences. Among them, the automatic definition of those who are opposing your particular policies as enemies of freedom, not just people who hold different sets of interests or different point of view about the world, but they are ipso facto enemies of freedom if they are opposing the national policies of the United States. And this has, on some occasions, gotten us into a lot of trouble, and it also gives us the self-proclaimed right to try to punish other places in the world that don't adhere to our point of view as, therefore, enemies of freedom. Very few countries in the world that I can think of define their national self-interest as the worldwide embodiment of freedom. When the French go around doing various national, international events, they'd say, well, this is in the interest of France, not in the interest of freedom for the whole of mankind. This is sort of one example of a larger, I think, tendency in our history to feel that we have the obligation, we have the power, because we embody the worldwide notion of freedom, to kind of stand as a judge over everybody else and to impose various kinds of sanctions on them. That's about all I can say about a question I'm not necessarily a total expert on. I'm going to invite anyone who wants to, if there is anyone, to address one more question to Randall Kennedy, because in the area of freedom and lack thereof, his wife is shortly going to be giving birth to their next child this week, and he does need to get back to Boston to on the last shuttle, so he has to leave a little earlier than the rest of us. So yes, go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Kennedy.
Yes.
To what extent does the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment have an impact in defining freedom and focusing on the struggle for freedom in the United States?
Well, it's you mentioned the 14th Amendment. There's no document in our law that's more important to freedom than the 14th Amendment. I mean, after all, before the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights was only applicable against the federal government. It was Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment that made the Bill of Rights applicable against the states. And nowadays, when there is a struggle about nowadays in the lives of most citizens, it's the state, the local authorities that pose the biggest danger to the civil liberties of individual citizens. So the 14th Amendment, more than any other, has been absolutely central in enlarging the freedoms that all Americans enjoy, at least on paper. And before I exit, and I do have to exit, I would like to take up a point that you were making and related to the gentleman's question about sanctions, because I wasn't altogether comfortable in your response on the question of us, of Americans being judges. I mean, there is an international struggle going on now about, for instance, international human rights. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take the position that, well, we have our own peculiar notions of things and we should not be take the posture of dictating to others, there's a certain attractive modesty to that position. On the other hand, if one embraces that position very tightly, then one disables oneself from talking about things like female circumcision, torture. Who are you to condemn torture? Well, it seems to me that we are people of the world.
Absolutely.
And that we should, on the one hand, we shouldn't be overcome by hubris. On the other hand, I think that we should embrace, in a self-critical way always, but have the willingness to embrace our beliefs and stand up for them. And as far as regimes around the world that are doing terrible things, yes, we should work, we should do all in our power to put pressure on dictatorships around the world so that we can make freedom ring for those who are enslaved under dictatorships that are, restricting freedoms. So I think on the one hand, we have to be careful about hubris. On the other hand, we should not surrender some of our hard-won insights into the nature of freedom. In any event, thank you very much.
Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy has to leave, but I will turn the podium over to Katha Pollitt. First, we will thank Randy for your very kind remarks. Good luck. I'll speak to you soon. Okay, Katha Pollitt.
Well, I'll never find out what Randy thinks of what I'm about to say, but I have to reply to that, because although that sounds very good and it sounds very moral, and in our own personal lives, of course, we don't like to think, oh yes, there are terrible things happening right next door, we don't do anything. The truth is, our government supports a lot of those horrible dictators.
Right.
That's the problem. I mean, for example, think of the Gulf War, which my daughter is now learning the most unbelievably propagandistic version of in 6th grade. It is truly shocking. Okay, so Iraq is so terrible. Well, it is so terrible. But Kuwait, they still don't let women vote. They don't even, you can't vote there unless your father lived in Kuwait in 1920 or something. They have some unbelievable, it's like you have to be kind of grandfathered in. Right. And this is the government that the regime that we were protecting. And I think you can look at a lot of our interventions and think, if you look behind the headlines, it wasn't so great. Is Somalia better off now? I don't think so. We don't seem to have done such a great job in some of these intervening places, and we have a very long history of supporting just the wrong people, like Latin America. Look at Pinochet. Well, here he is, the international war criminal. What about Kissinger? He's right here, So I think there's a big hypocrisy factor that is very clear to people who are not Americans. Who didn't grow up with our sense of, what our country is about, and who do see it as being like France. We have our interests. And it's so interesting because you can look back at history, as in Eric's book, and you look at, say, the First World War, which the progressives all got roped in. They said, oh yeah, now we're going to have that big nation state, and everything's going to be great for the workers, and and national self-determination, all that kind of thing. And none of it happened. It was just more imperialism, and the nation state, the little pathetic nation state they liked, was immediately dismantled, and there was the 10 most reactionary years in this country's history in the 20th century. So I think you can't just stop with these big words, because the big words are what get us in trouble in this country, I think.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Yes, sir. Right.
I think it was a deceptive title. Much too much time was spent, with all due respect to you, much too much time was spent complimenting you as a teacher, as a mentor, and as an author. And I think the time that Mr. Kennedy and Ms. Pollitt spent complimenting you, about your authorship, I don't say it wasn't deserved. It would have been much better spent talking as they are talking now, even with his presence no longer here. It would have been much better spent talking about issues, whether you agree or disagree about issues. Do you have differences in point of view from Professor Foner? We don't know that. You all seem to be on
Let me invite you, sir, to raise an issue that you would like to put on the table, if you would, then.
We can talk about freedom in the United States as we understand it, as we would like to see.
Right.
How would we like to deal with the internet freedom? Where is freedom of speech? Are there limits to freedom of speech? There are many people who use internet for anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-black, anti-Catholic propaganda. Is that allowed? Or is it the same as saying you can't yell fire in a crowded theater? That is no longer freedom of speech. Now, I think these are issues that the panel, including yourself, should have addressed initially after some introductory remarks by you. You were the moderator, but I think you missed the boat.
Well, I'm wondering what your own opinion of that question is then. Let me invite you to say what you think the limits of freedom of speech ought to be.
I was a student of Phil Foner's many years ago.
Uh-huh.
I don't know that I'm qualified to get up and make the statements, but be that as it may, there are statements and there are positions that could have been addressed and should have been addressed based upon the title that this was advertised to be. That is my opinion.
Okay. That is what we call freedom of expression. Yes.
I have a question for Ms. Pollitt. You mentioned the police brutality issue in New York City. I wonder if you'd comment on kind of an interesting phenomenon of it seems to me high voter acceptance of Rudy Giuliani. Yet, for example, I went to an AIDS commemoration this morning at City Hall. They had to go through the Second Court of Appeal to get there. And it was just an unbelievable scene. There were snipers on the roof. There were more police officers than there were people attending the rally. You had to go through metal detectors to get into the City Hall area. Why, given the value we place on freedom, why is this not brought to more people's attention, or why is it not of more concern? In fact, why does Giuliani rank so high in popularity polls?
I think you've brought a very interesting piece of real life into our discussion. See, I don't think people do hold freedom in such high regard, and I think one of the, to praise Eric's book yet again, I think he really shows that freedom is, freedom means a lot of things, and to some people what freedom means is I'm not going to be mugged, and I don't care what the police do to achieve that goal, and as long as they're beating people up in Harlem and I don't have to see it, that's fine. And okay, fine, pay the money. At the end of the year, yeah, sure, some people will be beaten up by accident, right, pay them off, goodbye. I think there's tremendous acceptance of police brutality in this city, and it's just, the New York Times did this whole series about, these poor people that are just beaten up for nothing, and how nothing happens to the perpetrators of that violence, and how it's complete cover-up, and it's completely accepted as the cost of doing business and doing police business in New York City. So I would have to say, I think that the respectable opinion of New York, at least the white ethnics that Rudy Giuliani plays to, I think he's written off people of color. They don't care. They don't care. And it's not part of what they mean by freedom. I mean, I'm sure they think it's comical that he does this thing with the snipers. I mean, he seems to be kind of losing control. but the more serious issues, I think people really, they're with him.
I think that the popularity of Giuliani does demonstrate, this is putting what Katha said in a slightly different way, but is that the previous 15 or 20 years of our city's history, for numerous reasons which one can sociologically analyze, had produced among large numbers of people and throughout the city a tremendous sense of insecurity. And I think that the promise of security, even when purchased at a rather high price for some people, as Katha said, has proved to be extremely popular. This is not saying anything that one can't, divine from public opinion polls, but I think that the sense of personal insecurity which had developed in the city in many, many different groups and areas in the 1970s and 80s, is probably the largest explanation for the willingness on the part of many people to turn a blind eye to some of the less attractive features of the administration as it is today. Yes.
How would you rate either of the Clinton administration as far as expanding or contracting freedom? Since Clinton, of the two candidates, seems to have represented more liberal or left.
The question asked us to judge or evaluate the extent to which the Clinton administration has expanded the realm or the enjoyment of freedom or has not done so. I don't know what to say about that, actually.
Well, I think that the record is pretty clear, actually. I think if it weren't that the Republicans are all, controlled by the gun nut, crazy religious fanatics, we would see much more clearly. I mean, Clinton is a very big contrast gainer, but look what's happened. We have the crime bill, which vastly expands, what you can get put in jail for, how long you go there. It puts they wanted to put kids in jail with grown-ups. Big expansion of the death penalty. So that's less freedom right there. More people in jail. Look at, for example, getting rid of the disparity of sentencing between crack and cocaine. One, a drug popular among black people, the other a drug popular among white people. One punished 100 times more than the other for the same possession of the same amount. There was a committee comes in and says, we don't like this is unfair, let's change it. No, the Clinton administration just throws it out. I think that Clinton is presiding over a tremendous ebbing of a tide of progressivism in many, many areas of life. And he's good, there are a few issues where he kind of holds the line, like he holds the line on choice. He holds the line on being openly racist. He's not going to do that. But the substance of things that have happened under his watch is very, very bad. And I think people don't realize that because they're thinking, oh no, next Pat Robertson will be running the country, if I don't think Clinton is good. And so there's a big attempt to think Clinton is good, but he isn't. So that's
I think
my point of view.
maybe we'll take one more question or comment, and then we can continue outside or later more individually, but the time is growing late. It is a weekday, so ma'am, yes. Do you want to stand when you...
At different points, people have talked about different freedoms, and just like two that come to mind is the freedom to marry and the freedom to vote. And clearly we have a right to vote, but I'm not certain that there's necessarily a right to marry. So I'm wondering, where does freedom intercede with rights, and sort of how do they connect?
That is a very good question. As I think Katha Pollitt suggested, rights tend to be entitlements that you gain that come from the government in some way, from a court decision, from a law. They are sort of legally established principles of what people are entitled to. Freedoms, I think, are much more amorphous than that. They can be legally established powers or entitlements, but they can also be more personally gained or established. Liberation is not something you gain necessarily from governmental law, but from sort of personal action very often. I think one of the points that I try to make, and Katha made, I think in her comments, was that since the 1960s, the language of freedom has been pretty much taken over more and more by more conservative groups in the society, whereas the liberal or left groups have used what is called rights talk. They have talked more and more about their rights and less about freedom or liberation. The reasons for this may be very complicated. One of the reasons is, I think, an over-reliance on courts to secure what people think they're entitled to. The civil rights movement, to some extent, inspired this, because it was the federal courts that, played a major role in implementing the legal rights that the civil rights movement was pressing for. In the 1970s, group after group went to court to secure their rights, often in a very important and powerful way. But your point is quite well taken. Freedom and rights they overlap, but they have different resonances as rallying cries. And I think for those who consider themselves on the more liberal spectrum of things, it is a mistake to cede the language of freedom to conservatives, as seems to have been done today. That's what I meant before when I said we can decide what freedom is. I don't believe we have a total power to do that, but at least we can try. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. We can continue talking individually if you like, and if anyone would like a copy of the book signed, we'll be out there.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.